to China Cup Forensics-Extempt final. Audience members, please remember there is no photography, video recording, or audio recording during this round. Please ensure that all mobile devices are switched off during this time. For extemporaneous speaking, audience members, please note that once the competition begins, you are required to remain in the room for the entirety of the round. I will stand at 7 minutes and 10 seconds and let the clock run out until the speakers finish. Extemporaneous speakers will come in after the preparation period, which for you has already elapsed.
In the Ming Dynasty, China had the power to become the world's next leading economic power through Zheng He's infamous voyages. Now, in the 21st century, China was presented with a similar opportunity, but threw it away. Therefore, when presented with the question, has China set itself on a course to become the world's leading power in the next decade? The answer is a definite and resounding no. Before I go into my points, I'd like to give some context for China and its role in today's status quo. China is one of the main global superpowers, along with America. It's the most populous country, and it actually is one of the largest exporters of goods. However, China is also a very communist nation, as most people know. It has very isolationist beliefs, very xenophobic tendencies that lead it to be a key point of controversy in many international relations. Chinese-Americans relations in today's stage can almost be compared to those of U.S. relations with the Soviet Union back in the Cold War. There is a huge amount of tension on a global scale between China and other superpowers, which is the main reason why it's unable to be a leading economic power. Three main reasons why China will not be the world's next leading economic power in the next decade. Firstly, because of the Chinese-American trade war. Secondly, because of China's Belt and Road Initiative. And thirdly, because of China's ever-existing isolationist ideals. Firstly, about the Chinese-American trade war. The Chinese, to put it simply, cannot compete with the Americans in terms of the trade. Chinese imports are almost 1/5 of that of Americans, according to CNN. Therefore, they cannot keep up this trade war for as long as the Americans can. In the Cold War, we saw a situation where both sides were at risk. It was a mutually destructive situation. However, with China and America, China is the one that will lose far more than America. Therefore, there is no feasible way that they can win this trade war. We've already seen that China has been severely impacted economically by this trade war. CNN said that America hit China with 10% tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese imports. This has a huge impact on the Chinese economy, which depends, as I said before, on exporting all of these goods and having people buy these goods. The slowing Chinese economy, as I said, can just not compete with Americans for as long as Americans can compete with Chinese. The set date for these resolutions to be solved is in of this year. However, if this tension isn't solved, if the trade war isn't solved by February, the war will only escalate and more tariffs will be placed on Chinese goods. Why will the war not actually be solved in the February negotiation? It's because of the political tensions that exist between China and America. Both have very strong-minded leaders, Trump and Xi Jinping, and we can see that there is no way that they can cooperate and solve all of their not just economic differences, but also ideological differences by February. This means that economic trade war will only escalate from February, which I said China cannot keep up with. Secondly, China is not on the course to become the world's next economic power because of their Belt and Road Initiative. This would seem counterintuitive because the Belt and Road Initiative was built to help China's economy, but it has actually hurt it in a number of ways. So the Belt and Road Initiative, or what's called the OBOR, was an initiative that China did to give loans to developing countries in exchange for China's help in building infrastructure. They built many of these loans to be predatory so that they could gain land from these developing countries. But their entire scheme to play a dirty game and to get land and money from these developing countries has backfired in a number of ways. Firstly, China is still giving loans to many of these developing countries for the Belt and Road Initiative. Many of these countries, since they're developing, are unable to pay back the loans. Now, this is what China, even though they refuse to admit it, this is what China intended. They intended people to not be able to pay back the loans and therefore get land and reciprocation for that. However, we can see that the kind of land that they're getting gives them some amount of political power, but actually no economic power whatsoever, because they no longer have the money or demand to develop the infrastructure on this land that they are gaining. So while they may develop a stronger military and have a stronger political presence in Asia through the Belt and Road Initiative, they are sacrificing their economy. Secondly, we would say that they won't even actually achieve this idea of having a stronger political influence because many of the developing countries that they attacked are now retaliating. For example, they had a $60 billion loan in Pakistan, and now Pakistan wants out of this debt. We can see that they're only deteriorating their relationships with the countries that they're supposedly trying to help or trying to make money off of. This means that in the future, any chance of trade, which China needs to be doing more in today's globalized era, is completely gone, right? And most importantly, we can see that the U.S. has recognized that China is trying to increase its presence in Asia and therefore is retaliating. U.S. spent $113 million in Asia to counteract China's Belt and Road Initiative, according to BBC. And as I said before, because the U.S. has so much more money, has a stronger military, political, and economic power, it can easily out-dominate China in Asia. So if China continues to influence the Belt and Road Initiative, America will step in, the developing countries will drop out, and they will simply be giving loans without much to gain. Thirdly, and most importantly, China remains very isolationist. They refuse to give up the isolationist ideals and beliefs that their entire country was founded upon, right? Now, this is understandable, seeing China's position, seeing their historical xenophobia and why they might develop this. However, this means a lot of trouble for their economy. Their isolationist ideals means that their economy is their local economy is deteriorating, mainly because there is no demand for the economy to grow. Firstly, about infrastructure. Investment in the last decade has found to go from double digits to single digits because there's not enough demand for this infrastructure. Many cities in China had elaborate infrastructure projects planned from many decades before, but are now unable to carry out those infrastructure projects because they don't have enough funding for them and because there's simply not enough demand for them. They expected demand because of an influx of immigrants, but we can see that this doesn't happen because China is so isolationist and because, as I already said, they're deteriorating their relationship with so many countries that there's just not enough migrants in demand for this kind of infrastructure. For example, The Economist said that Chengdu was planning on developing an extensive subway line, but cut that down to 6 fewer lines because it knew that it does not have the funding to carry out this infrastructure, and that the profit would not return the cost it takes to build this. Secondly, there's simply less consumption because of this less demand. The sale in cars dropped this year. The total GDP debt went from 150% to 300% according to CNN, and it's the worst performing stock market this year. As China asserts its dominance ironically falls economically. It has not, in fact, set itself up to be the world's next leading economic power, but instead set itself up for a devastating economic crisis. Thank you.
The time was 6 minutes and 59 seconds.
I do have the question.
Oh, they have it already.
They have it?
Yeah.
That's cool. That's cool. I want to make sure.
You guys ready? Okay. You begin when you're ready.
On face, Saudi Arabia seems like a liberalizing country. It's recently granted women their first ability to drive. It's liberalizing economically, allowing for entrepreneurial opportunities for every individual within the country. And it's even played the emoji movie in the first cinema, allowing for people to laugh and enjoy at looking at emojis bounce around on a screen. But if you look deep down into Saudi Arabia, it isn't a liberalizing country. It's one where Prince Salman is using the notion of globalization to attract Western powers to invest in them. It's one that constantly kills individuals who have diametrically opposed views to Prince Salman, and it's one that's attempting to gradually consolidate power and deceive the Saudis. And therefore, on the question of does the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul show that Western powers should change their relationship with Saudi Arabia, my answer is a resounding and definite yes. I want to look at this in terms of 3 different aspects. First of all, on how the values of the West is diametrically opposed to those of Saudi Arabia. Second of all, on how in the past empirically, there has been systematic and there has been a list of heinous crimes that Prince Salman has committed, which has been made in light of the Khashoggi killing. And third and finally, I want to look at how the relationship that Saudi Arabia has with the West is one that is not only archaic, but in the status quo, one that is not beneficial, and therefore the West should adopt a different approach with Saudi Arabia. Before I go on to my first reason, I want to give you a quick characterization as to what the issue is like right now. According to an October 2018 Economist article, it states that Khashoggi was a, quote, a prominent Saudi journalist and government critic. He constantly spoke out against Prince Salman and his liberalizing reforms, and he constantly called him a fraud or an individual who isn't necessarily liberalizing. What happened to Khashoggi was he walked into the Saudi consulate in Turkey and was then reportedly killed by a bunch of guys who also walked into the consulate holding bone saws and things like that within their luggage. Therefore, this killing begs the question of whether or not we should reconsider what the intentions of the Saudi government is and whether or not the West should create good and close diplomatic ties with the Saudis. I say yes, and here are my 3 reasons. First of all, the values of the West are diametrically opposed to those of Saudi Arabia. According to a November 2018 Washington Examiner article, it states that the West has constantly been condemning the killing of Khashoggi. It states that Paul Ryan, which is the Speaker of the House for the United States, quote, is demanding discussions with moral clarity and has already had many of the Saudi officials, quote, sanctioned and punished by the United States because of the killing that happened. Moreover, you need to recognize that the West and a lot of Western liberal democracies are those who are built on the basis and the values of free speech. Built on the basis that you have the ability to exercise your freedoms to be who you want and do what you want, and have the ability to believe in what you want, i.e. the freedom of religion. Therefore, when according to a Vox 2017 August article, it states that Saudi Arabia has the likes of the Sharia law in place and has the likes of the aggressive policies that systematically discriminate against individuals who are non-Islam and non-male, this is quite problematic in nature, as the values then within Saudi society is completely different from the values that the West is built upon. Even though other people might say, oh, Saudi Arabia is a liberalizing force, they're allowing women to drive, they're playing the emoji movie, that's not necessarily the case. Because according to a May 2018 Washington Post article, it talks about the arrest of a high-profile feminist that was of Saudi Arabian origin. This shows that though Prince Salman on face is supporting a liberalizing agenda, he in fact deep down is trying to prevent liberalization so he's able to consolidate power. Therefore, if the West continues to work with this type of a leader and this type of a country, this is symbolically undermining all of the values that the West has stood for since the creation of Western liberal democracies. Therefore, I think that on light of the Jamal Khashoggi killing, the West should adopt a different approach with Saudi Arabia. Second of all, I want to look at the empirically, the past injustices that Prince Salman has committed. First of all, according to November 2018 Economist article, it talks about how Saudi Arabia is constantly, quote, undermining the models of democracy, and talking about how Prince Salman is fundamentally, quote, turning Saudi Arabia into a force for geopolitical instability. This looks like the manifestation of the Yemen civil war. This also looks like the perpetuation of geopolitical conflict that allows for rogue nations like Iran to continuously consolidate and justify their consolidation of power and territorial control. Given this, I think that we need to reconsider the approach, because when the West continuously backs up a dictator like Salman, it allows for more geopolitical instability to exist within the Middle East and allows for innocent lives and innocent individuals who want to believe in things like the freedom of speech to be killed. Moreover, according to a November 2018 Business Insider article, it talks about how Prince Salman in the past has committed, quote, dubious activity. Instances in which he's kidnapped the Prime Minister of Lebanon or imprisoned individuals who have interests or views that are different from his. When Prince Salman is an individual that continuously wants to consolidate power and disregards freedom of speech and the freedom to expression, this is someone that the West ought not and should not be working with in order to uphold the principal notion of freedoms of speech. Third and finally, I want to look at the relationship that the West has had in the past with Saudi Arabia and why in the status quo it is one that is not only archaic but also non-beneficial. I want to look at this in terms of 2 parts. First on why it's archaic. According to a July 2014 Vox article, it talks about how Saudi Arabia and the US originally had ties because of the Cold War. Because back in the Cold War, US wanted 1, geopolitical control within the Middle East, but 2, a good and stable resource for oil. However, none of these interests matter anymore in the status quo. Because first, in terms of looking at geopolitical stability, US now has allies like Israel and other actors that are able to act as a geopolitical control and a place for US to exert soft power within the status quo. Second of all, in terms of looking at resources, the US no longer needs Saudi Arabia as a prominent provider of oil because it has now other countries and allies it can work with, and it's arguably having one of the biggest economies right now, so therefore they do have the ability to work with other countries. Second of all, I want to look at why this is a non-beneficial relationship, even if it's not archaic. Because according to the same Business Insider article, it talks about how the Khashoggi killing has, quote, caused Prince Salman to be formed or to be the subject of mass protests in Tunisia and Argentina. Therefore, at the very best case, if the West continues to work with Prince Salman, they're going to negatively influence their international image and make it hard for them to find allies all over the world, because now everyone will believe that the West is not someone who lives up and is principally consistent with the values they've constantly forwarded. Therefore, I've told you 3 things today. First of all, why the West has interests that are diametrically opposed to Saudi Arabia. Second of all, why Saudi Arabia has committed empirically a lot of heinous acts. And third of all, why the relationship between the Saudi Arabian government and the West is not necessarily beneficial. So because of all these reasons, on whether or not the West should reconsider the relationship with Saudi Arabia, my answer is a resounding and definite yes. Thank you.
The time was 7 minutes and 2 seconds. It's a cool one. Thank you.
Oh yeah.
Very jealous.
So good luck.
I don't know. Trying to do it.
Apple Jacks.
I'm not gonna do it. It's so much trouble.
Should have thought that when you had something in the group chat.
My topic is the China one.
Number 401.
Yes.
You can do it right.
The people of the nation of Sri Lanka live in fear since its creation. Fear because the countries around it, like India, resent them. Fear because no global power wants to trade with them. This fear isn't just Sri Lanka. It's across many nations in the world. Nations like Iran, Belarus, Sri Lanka, Kenya, and numerous more nations. However, this fear does not exist anymore and has been quenched by one gentle giant. That giant is China. China has enabled itself to do economical interactions unseen by any other superpower. And when the question is asked, has China set itself on a course to be the world's largest economical power in the next decade? The answer, of course, is a yes. I want to talk about 3 things in my speech. Firstly, I want to talk about China's dominance in global markets. Secondly, I want to talk about the withdrawal of nations like the United States. Thirdly, I'll talk about why China is the best trading partner any nation could ever wish for. But before that, what do we mean by economical power? Economical power isn't raw GDP size, right? It's other things, like how much does your product dominate the product of another? Why is this true? Because if I asked you, what nation has more economical power, the UK or Brazil? Everyone would say the UK. However, Brazil has a larger GDP, which means that economical power is dictated by the ability of your goods to influence others, not necessarily your GDP. On to the first reason why, China's dominance in global markets. According to the Vox News Corporation, the Belt and Road ambitions and other ambitions committed by China to increase its global trade has been the most ambitious economical projects in history. In the next 10 years, how will this develop? Firstly, in various regions around the world. Firstly, in China and Europe, China would have established its railroad with Europe, enabling China and Europe to trade like no other nation with Europe to trade. Why? Because railroads are better than any other alternatives, i.e., they're faster than things like cargo ships. In Africa, China would have completed the Chinese-African Railroad, which would have allowed China to tap the untapped resources of nations like the Congo, of nations like Swaziland, of nations like Lesotho, which no other power has been able to tap. In the Middle East, China's relations with Middle Eastern countries are increasing at a faster rate than any other nation. In Oceania, Australia and China are China is Australia's largest exporter and trading partner. And so what we see from all these observations is that China has a grasp and is developing a grasp through its current projects on different global economies that no other actor can. Right? This shows that China will be dominant and will in fact be dominant in many unique ways. Secondly, I will talk about U.S. withdrawal, right? How the United States is withdrawing from global politics. The Wall Street Journal notes that the United States and China, the battle of those two big economical powers, will determine which one is more economically influential. And moreover, according to the same Wall Street Journal article, the United States is being jeopardized right now because it's withdrawn, right? The United States is embarking on a policy of isolationism and anti-trade. There are a few things on this. One is that the United States is imposing tariffs on other nations. That is decreasing its economic hegemony because you have less trade when you have tariffs. Secondly, is that the Chinese economy is developing at a rate much faster than that of the United States. For example, according to Statista, the United States economy in the last 30 years has grown from anywhere from 2 to 6% every year. Contrast that with China's 6 to 14% annual growth, right? So China's economy is growing at a much faster rate. And because the United States is very protectionist and because its economy is not growing very fast, we think China will dominate over the US. But even if the United States and other countries would also like to trade, even if the United States replaces Donald Trump and replaces it with a pro-trade leader and a pro-economical hegemony leader, why will China still come out on top? This is why. Because the American method of trading and the debt that America has accumulated makes it simply unsustainable. The United States of America is in $21 trillion of debt, whereas China is not even that of 5% in its debt, which means that American trade is going to be unsustainable because debt gets more and more expensive the longer it takes. So in the long run, China will come out on top of that after. So all in all, summing up on this point here, in the future, the United States, with its withdrawal and many other countries, China will fill that vacuum and become the economical superpower, right? Moreover, this isn't just a theory; it's actually happening in real life, right? For example, in Canada, when the United States imposed a 40% tariff, according to MSNBC, on Canadian goods, on a variety of Canadian products. Because of this, Justin Trudeau immediately turned to China, right? Trade of China and Canada and them discussing bilateral agreements increased exponentially after the United States decided to withdraw. We saw this in many other countries. We saw this in nations. We saw this also in nations, for example, in places like South America, where Venezuela has also turned to China, and whereas Brazil is also turning into China right now. And thirdly, I'll talk about why China is the best trading partner, and in terms of political stability, is more likely to come out on top. Because fundamentally, the problem with every other actor that can possibly be the world's most influential actor is that they're all plagued by something called political instability. It's an inevitable part of democracy, right? Because, for example, you can have a pro-trade leader at first, but 4 years later, an anti-trade leader is elected, right? So if another nation is looking to trade with that nation, they're less likely to trade, right? Because that trade might be unsustainable, because the next leader might just rip up the bilateral agreement, as we saw in the UK, as we saw in Brazil, right? So they tell you, because of that political instability, other nations are not likely to have good economical interaction, will be very viable spots for economical interaction, because they're not seen as viable and they're seen as unstable, which is really bad for trade, because you want trade to be a long-term thing. Why is it then that China does not have the problem? Because China is a one-party state. The consistent economic policy of China will always be consistent because the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, will always be in power, and their agenda will always be the same, instead of changing every 4 years when a new person is elected. We see this with real-life examples, right? This is why China is the only nation that can embark on something as ambitious as the One Belt, One Road, right? No other nation can do this because they risk this project being cancelled by the next administration that will replace the current administration. So, all in all, what does all of this mean? In the global arena, In the global economic arena, it is a game of giants, big nations, and goblins, small nations. The giants are rowdy, they constantly politically change their ambitions, they also don't really care about you or your trade. However, out of all these giants and all these hegemons, there is one gentle giant. That gentle giant is China. They actually care about you, they're stable, and they're a much more viable trading partner. For all of these reasons, we think China is going to top and be the world's most economical power. Thank you very much.
The time was 6 minutes and 58 seconds.
Saudi-Western relations were founded on nothing but absolute faith, genuine hope, and sincere trust. Here's when they bombed Egyptian hospitals and churches. We put faith in them that they would stop. When they committed humanitarian abuses in Lebanon, we hoped that they would stop. And when they left children dying on the streets in Yemen and Syria, we hoped and we trusted that they would stop. But they never did. And now, that faith, that hope, that trust, as delicate as the innocence of their lives, is now dead. Because they made the wrong move to murder a US permanent resident on foreign soil. And the West needs to respond, because they need to show the world that they will not tolerate pernicious acts against humanity and egregious policies against dignity. So ultimately, on the question of, does the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul show that Western powers should change their relationship with Saudi Arabia, my answer is a definite and resounding yes. I have three things that I want to talk about in this speech. Firstly, I'll be talking about why Saudi Arabia has continuously shown a willingness to embody anti-Western ideas and not listen, and this is not even the first time. Secondly, I'll be talking about why it is simply unstrategic in practical terms for the West to stay. And thirdly, I'll be talking about this idea of international condemnation on public dissent towards the West. So on to the first point of how this shows that the Saudi Arabia regime is willing to embody anti-Western ideals and not listen. According to an article published by BBC on October 31st, there have been multiple humanitarian rights abuses all around the Middle East, including in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Egypt. This has amounted to up to 70,000 plus deaths. They have been bombing hospitals, and they have been blockading supplies so that the innocents, that the children and the women cannot reach those supplies and even survive. And when this happened, we swallowed our pride and we showed our discontent, but they didn't listen to us. And so we just placed raw faith in them, and yet they still didn't listen. Fast forward to right now. According to an Economist article published on November 24th of 2018, Khashoggi was, and I quote, throttled, dismembered, and probably dissolved in acid by 15 men hit squads. Now, they took it to a whole new level when they did this. And this was even worse because they denied any wrongdoing for the first few weeks that this happened. Now, note that although there was mounting evidence that proved that Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabian regime, was completely guilty for these wrongdoing acts, they still denied all this happening. So this shows that there are anti-Western ideals, and this shows that they have a tendency to commit humanitarian crisis against these people. The third article that I want to mention is from The Guardian on November 13th. Because Khashoggi was a permanent resident of the United States, and he was a columnist, and he wrote against the Saudi regime. And this shows that Saudi Arabia was most likely trying to silence his thoughts, trying to silence any dissent against the government. And this shows they don't believe in freedom of press or freedom of speech, the things that we premised our democracy upon. Because transparency and educational discourse are the fundamental building blocks of democracy that we are able to call ourselves on society today. All in all, the West should never help a regime that dishumanizes people, strips away their identity and their dignity, and then denies any wrongdoing. That is morally unjustified and is never something that the West should support. On to the second point, of how it is simply unstrategic in practical terms for the West to stay. According to an article published by The Atlantic on December 1st, the West sees Saudi Arabia as a regional ally and has placed large amounts of trust in them. Because both sides knew that these strategic alliances were premised on trust. And when Saudi Arabia is housing American soldiers and Western soldiers, they need this trust to know that Saudi Arabia will not abuse those people as well. However, when Saudi Arabia kills someone from the West, denies any wrongdoing, and says that we don't know anything about it, that is the moment that it shows that Saudi Arabia doesn't really care anything about the West, and that Saudi Arabia can't be trusted. So this shows that the West can no longer really trust Saudi Arabia as an ally, and when it comes to these military terms, they should never have these relations with someone that they can never trust. This leads me on to my third point, about how there is massive public dissent, both internationally and regionally. According to an article published by The Economist on November 24th, there have been already large-scale protests that took place in America after the confirmed murder of Jamal Khashoggi. This shows that the general public obviously doesn't like everything that is going on when Trump tries to say things like, we're going to still cooperate with Saudi Arabia. Additionally, America is a democracy, which means that they adhere to the mindset of the people. And when the people are riled up, and when they want change, change must happen, because that is the only way the democracy actually works. But beyond that, on the international level, the West needs to take on a morally justified stance. They need to show to the world that they don't just care about the oil in Saudi Arabia. They need to show the world that they're not just there from the money that they get from the arms deals that they engage with Saudi Arabia. They need to take a moral stance that says that they are the protectors of human rights, and they are the guardians of righteousness that we all deem them to be in the status quo. Let me summarize what I've told you today. I've told you that firstly, that Saudi Arabia has a tendency to embody anti-Western ideals and to commit human atrocities and not listen, and this is not even the first time that they've done it. I told you secondly, that it's unstrategic for the West to stay as an ally with someone that they cannot even trust on the most basic level. And thirdly, I've shown you that there's massive public dissent, both internally and externally, and the West must take a morally justified stance in order to show that they are the West that we view them as they are today. So ultimately on the question of does the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul show that Western nations should change their relationship with Saudi Arabia, my answer is a definite and resounding yes. Thank you.
time was 6 minutes and 40 seconds. You can start when you are ready.
Today, I want to talk about the Chinese dream. And like the American dream, where individuality is emphasized, the Chinese dream is all about collective identity, collective greatness, and the great restoration of Chinese superior identity. This mentality, combined with a strong leader and a strong state, along with the world's most effective dictatorship capitalist economy hybrid, presents the China we know today, the geopolitical, economic superpower that we see today. Therefore, to answer the question, has China set itself on a course to become the world's leading economic power in the next decade? My answer is a resounding yes. I'll be examining the issue in three perspectives. Firstly, on Chinese economic efficiency. Secondly, on growing Chinese geopolitical soft power. And thirdly, on the diminishing U.S. role within the global stage. Firstly, on this idea of the efficient Chinese economy. According to October 7th Guardian article 2018, the headline reads, China pumped $109 billion into the economy through the central bank. This stands in stark contrast to the world's #1 economy, the United States. The reason for this disparity is because the United States operates with checks and balances. That is to say, the United States Federal Reserve, the equivalent of Chinese central bank, operates independently from the executive branch, which is the president. This means that when President Trump imposes tariffs, which he is within his rights to do that, the Federal Reserve may or may not react as quickly or as efficiently as the Chinese central bank, Because at the end of the day, in the United States system, the Federal Reserve is isolated from the executive branch. Therefore, when we be in the best interest to the nation from an executive perspective, from a holistic governmental perspective, may not be what the Federal Reserve believes is best for the economy. An example of this is Trump's recent feud with the head of the Fed in regards to interest rates. Because the Federal Reserve is independent from the United States government, when Trump wants lower interest rates, the federal chairman did not listen to him, and rather continue with a policy of high interest rates to protect, in his view, the integrity of the United States economy. This disparity stands in stark contrast to the Chinese economy, where everything is subordinate to the Central Planning Committee. Although this may seem risky to some, what this offers rather is economic flexibility, especially in the face of the ever-changing US-China trade feud. For example, China can simply pump $109 billion into its economy, no questions asked. China can, with the Belt and Road Initiative, China can also hand out loans and hand out infrastructure investments to all other developing nations as long as the Central Committee wishes. Therefore, this economic flexibility allows China to divert its funds where it needs, whether that be politically, whether that be economically, and at the end of the day, presents China with a superior economic leverage over the world's leading #1 economy, which is the United States. And therefore, on that front, we believe that the Chinese economy is more efficient and more flexible in that regard. Secondly, on this idea of growing Chinese geopolitical soft power, right? In an Economist article written January 5th, 2019, it is mentioned that in April, foreign leaders would gather to discuss the Belt and Road Initiative. And a senior Chinese diplomat is quoted as saying that this is the most important event this year in China. Therefore, first, to be economically powerful, you need trade. To trade, you need partners. China is getting partners. Though Chinese government may be investing in countries where many individuals believe to be underdeveloped or developing nations that lacks funds, the economic flexibility of China and China's willingness to enter in deals with its allies means that they are building up the economies of these nations. Building up the economies of these nations is important to the Chinese economy because when these nations have a baseline economic sufficiency to support its own people, they can then start purchasing Chinese manufactured goods. And therefore, in that regard, when China begins investing in neighboring countries through the Belt and Road initiatives, through interest-free loans, we see them building up other nations so that they can purchase Chinese goods and increase Chinese geopolitical advantage in the world. Whereas in the United States, we see an isolationist leader unwilling to do this. So my third and final point is on a diminishing U.S. role, because what good speech has China and the United States, right? On October 13th, 2018 article, it is written that China accounts for 1/3 of the investment in Israeli technology. Why is this significant? This is because Israel is not only a longtime U.S. ally, but also a longtime Trump ally. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Trump has a relationship going way back. However, at the end of the day, it is China that is able to invest in Israeli technology. And therefore, we believe that even when hardline U.S. allies, such as the State of Israel, accept Chinese loans, that is when we see the U.S. geopolitical advantage in this world start to shrink. Because if Israel can be bought, then who's next? Maybe Turkey? Maybe Iraq? So therefore, when we see U.S. losing allies on a global front and China expanding its allies on a global front, not only do we see a larger opportunity for these nations to purchase Chinese manufactured goods, but rather we see diminishing opportunity for these nations to trade with the United States. This is exceptionally true with Trump's recent views with Canada, with the European Union. These countries were left with no choice but to engage with China, the world's second largest economy. Therefore, we believe that it is clear that China is on track to become the world's largest leading economic power, not only because of its own flexible economic system, not only because of its own geopolitical advantage, but also diminishing U.S. geopolitical advantage in the global arena. Yes, China may have serious human rights violations. China may abduct its own citizens. China may shut down internet in the whole province for 3 months. But at the end of the day, with a population of 1.4 billion, with a strong leader, all guided by the Chinese dream, how could they possibly lose? Thank you.
The time was 6 minutes and 22 seconds. Thank you guys. You guys said